嗨，在直，所有的人都静音了，后按照空格键暂时解除静音。嗨，
Yeah. Hello and welcome, everyone. Today we kick off our new series titled In Conversation. In this first episode of In Conversation, Professor Richard Nelson will engage in an intellectual autobiographical conversation with Professor Franco Malerba. Chris Freeman's Centenary Lecture Series was started early this year by a few alumni of Global-X to commemorate Christopher Freeman in the year of his birth centenary. This is an online virtual activity run with rather frugal means. It is fueled by mere enthusiasm. The objective of this series is to document the lives and works of major innovation scholars of the day. Today, we will listen to Professor Nelson speaking about his own evolution, contributions, critical self-evaluation, and his take on the future. Of course, as the saying goes, no man ever steps in the same river twice. The idea of the series emerged from a discussion with Bent Oke Lundwall, our patron. Bent Oke and Edward Lawrence helped in shaping this project. Carlota Perez, Alan Freeman, Luke Such, and Mamomuchi have been supportive. Thanks Bal, Ned, Carlota, Alan, Luke, and Mamo. UNU Merit is co-organizing this series. I thank UNU Merit and its director, Bartel Vanderwall. I also wish to thank the members of our core committee, especially Nandita Matthew, Swati Mehta, Veronica Robert, Sean Cunningham, Indu, and Justin Kumar for their hard work over the past several months in realizing this dream project. After the conversation, we will take a break of 5 minutes and then proceed to discussion. We have 1 hour for the discussion, starting with a few questions already received from a panel of scholars and subsequently open for general discussion. Please feel free to type in your well-framed questions in the chat box. We will take them up and pass on to Franco to deal with. I do not want to rob Franco of his prerogative to introduce Nelson. Instead, I will briefly introduce Franco. Franco Malerba is Professor of Applied Economics at Bocconi University. He contributed to fields of innovation, evolutionary theory, sectoral systems, industrial dynamics, etc. He is editor of the Journal of Industrial and Corporate Change, advisory editor of research policy, and associate editor of the Journal of Evolutionary Economics. Franco was befittingly awarded the Schumpeter Prize in 2012. Now I invite Professor Nelson and Franco to take over the floor. Thank you. Over to you, Franco.
Thank you, Rajesh, for this introduction. Well, I have to say it's great to start this series with Richard Nelson, who was a great friend of Chris Freeman. And everybody in our community of economists, technologists, business scholars, historians, sociologists, public policy scholars know Richard Nelson. Just to introduce him very briefly, Dick got his PhD from Yale, has been an economist at the Rand Corporation, a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, then was professor at economics at Yale, where he was also director of ISPS, the Institute for Social and Policy Studies, then professor at Columbia University, where he directed also the program of science, technology and global development and the Columbia Earth Institute. Well, if I have to define Dick Nelson as a scholar, I have to say that he's a giant. And I can say that most of us, if not all of us, stand on the shoulder of this giant. He has written landmark pieces on evolutionary theory, technological change, economic growth, innovation systems and institutions, and more broadly on understanding the economy as a complex, evolving system. And we all know him for his landmark book, An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change, that he wrote with Sid Winter. And this book has become the foundation of the evolutionary approach to innovation, the firm, the capability approach, industrial transformation, and economic change. And I have to say that Dick has really contributed to create not an invisible college, but a visible college of scholars that share a common view and understanding of the economy and share an evolutionary view of change and economic progress. So, a giant as a scholar, but also a very interdisciplinary scholar. Dick has a wide and broad readings and understanding of a lot of disciplines, from biology to history to political science, sociology, technology, and others. And another characteristics of Dick that struck me in my professional career is that Dick is able to organize and manage effectively large group of heterogeneous scholars. I remember when I was a student, the Institute of Social and Policy Studies at Yale. Or I remember the project that became the book on National Innovation System. Or the other broad project on industries that became the book on sources of industrial leadership. Or again, the project on catch-up that became the book on economic development as a learning process. So Dick has this unique ability to talk and interact and work together with very different people from very different disciplines and very different methodologies, from the theorist to the empirical scholar. And I think this is rather, it's not common among our group of scholars. So I have had the honor and the privilege of being a PhD student at Dick at Yale. So I have so many personal memory of him. Since I don't know if Dick remembers, since his first course that I took with him, the economics of technical change, that he gave to the second year students. And I came from Italy as a young PhD student. I was a Sraffian. Nobody probably knows who Sraffa is now. I was interested in new approaches, and I was rather critical of current mainstream economics. So in few words, I was a student searching for something meaningful. And Dick introduced me and opened evolutionary theory to me, and also a new view of looking at technological change and the economy. Then Dick became my advisor in my PhD dissertation. And if I have one memory of my years at Yale, I remember his office at Yale University, and his door always open to me. He was there, ready to discuss, to open new perspectives to me. And he was definitely inspiring, but also patient and forceful in his view. And we had a great interaction, me as a student and he as a professor. Then he followed my early academic years. We became then co-authors and also friends. So in a sense, all my professional trajectory has been related in various ways to Dick Nelson. And I also, as again, personal memory, would like to stress the key role of Dick in the creation and support of the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four was composed by Dick Nelson, Sidney Winter, Luigi Orsenigo, and I, when we developed a new generation of evolutionary models of innovation and industry evolution, the history-friendly models. And I remember the highly intellectually exciting meeting among the four of us in New York, Washington, or Milano in the preparation of the book. Well, let me say that not only as a mentor, but also as a person, Dick has always been extremely generous with his time to everybody, not just to me, but to everybody, students and colleagues, eager to discuss, but also Dick has been very unique in able to listen to people. And he was always, and he's been extremely kind and open person, and very social and interactive, characterized by great hospitality. I have to say that in the course of the various decades, his wife Catherine and Dick had so many people in their Hampden house, then in your New York house, all engaged in pleasant, interesting and broad conversation, maybe over a glass of white wine or during dinner. And I have to say a more restricted number of people also invited and spending time at their great summer house at the Cape. So I think Dick is a unique person and a unique scholar. And I want to organize the conversation with him today in the following way. I will start discussing with Dick his formative years and the major influence that other scholars had on him in the development of his thoughts and of the evolutionary theory. And then after some conversation with him, I will move to ask him and discuss with him his major contributions. And then finally, I want to close discussing the major challenges ahead and the basic messages to new generation of scholars. So after a break, as Rajesh mentioned, we will open the floor for questions. There are many friends and many scholars that want to ask questions to Dick, and so members of our broad visible and invisible college, and so we will move to questions and answer, and we will finish into our max. So let's start about the formative years and major influence on Dick's thoughts. And as I mentioned in my introduction, Dick in his early years had been a PhD at Yale, then became a professor at Yale, but he spent some time at the Rand Corporation and then at Sprue with frequent visits. He met Chris Freeman and also Keith Pavitt and the other people at Sprue several times. So on this, I have three related questions. So in which way, Dick, these institutions affect your way of thinking? And which were the key scholars that affected your thinking? I mean, you mentioned a lot in your early writing, Schumpeter and Simon, and maybe other have been relevant, and also which people play a key role. Of course, Sid Winter was one of them. Chris was another, but also you mentioned a lot of Burton Klein at Rand. So basically, I'd like you to tell us, to share with us your thoughts and reflection, your formative years, and on the people that shaped or affected your thinking. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to say how much I feel honored by and happy about being able to contribute to this series of sessions in honor of Chris Freeman. What a wonderful man Chris was. Both a wonderful person as well as a scholar. And he influenced me enormously over the years. And I'll come back in a moment to a little bit more of the details on that. But let me drink an orange juice toast because it's morning to Sid, to Chris, a wonderful guy. And by the way, along that line, in a way, I think we also ought to remember the person who worked so closely with Sid over the years, and who during the era when they were both so prominent, enormously set the tone here. And so many of you were faculty members or students at SPRU at that time, and that is Keith Pavitt. And here's to Keith as well. Over the years, I have been so lucky to have worked with some wonderful students and graduate students who over the years became my friends and scholars and co-authors. And Franco, I've just been delighted in my acquaintance with you as you became a master scholar. But you know something? I think it should be mentioned, though I think you try to hide it. And that is, over the years, you never managed to beat me in tennis. But I think we're right now too old for one more try. But who knows? We may try it again. Let me observe a little bit on how I came into this field, because I do think it's relevant as you look back on the history of economic thought more generally. I was, first of all, a graduate student, and a number of years later, as Franco was indicating, was for 18 years a faculty member at Yale University. And when I was a graduate student, which I was in the early 1950s, economics, the mother discipline for a number of us, was a much more open discipline in terms of how it was taught and the nature of the discussions that were going on. Then it became in the late 1960s and 70s, and for many years thereafter. In my graduate training at Yale, I read quite widely in the history of economic thought, which, as I understand it, more or less dropped out of the graduate curricula in most fields of graduate education in economics. And the neoclassical economics that was most definitely taught and focused on was not taught essentially as semi-religious dogma. It was taught as essentially one way to look at various matters. And economic history played a very important role in graduate economic education in those years, both when I was a graduate student and when I was a faculty member. I was never discouraged, as Franco sort of signaled, for crossing across what later on became much firmer disciplinary boundaries in exploring a particular matter. It was quite natural, for example, for scholars training in economics when they are trying to understand the economics of a fiscal and monetary policy, also to sort of look in some detail at the politics of that, and essentially how did you get formed, and try to understand how people voted and how Congress moved in particular directions. And in those days, the notion of that individuals and organizations truly optimized in terms of the decisions they faced was never presented as gospel. It became gospel later, nor the notion of equilibrium. I benefited enormously from my Yale education and my experience there. And as Franco said, person who I think probably influenced me most in terms of his view of what economics was about, also his wonderful qualities as a person, and in particular his open door, which I learned as a graduate student, was Jim Tobin. I think so much of the academic intellectual enterprise in those days was much more flexible and open than it became down the road. I see signs it may be opening up now. I certainly hope so. So immediately after I finished my graduate work in economics at Yale, I was already very, very much interested in technical change, and had a reasonably strong undergraduate background in the sciences and math. I applied to the Social Science Research Council of the United States, and I asked for them to sponsor a year of undergraduate education in engineering, which I took at MIT. And the Social Science Research Council at that time was flexible enough to be able to support that type of training. That was enormously useful for me. What that taught me to be able to do and enabled me to do intellectually was basically to read in most fields of science and engineering, not in the sense that I understood the field as I would have had I been a professional, but I could understand what they were talking about and what the issues are. My years at Rand were similarly very, very open, flexible, and interdisciplinary. When I came into the field, there was hardly anybody that was working either in the United States or in the UK or in Europe on technological change. There were a group of technological historians that were writing and doing research. But the field was very, very limited indeed. And I mentioned earlier the Social Science Research Council. When I was a young graduate student, the Ford Foundation initiated a small group support program of young scholars working in the field of technical change. And that included myself, scholars like Edwin Mansfield, that I think many of you have read, Zvi Grilikis, Joe Peck, and gradually a community of young economists studying technical change began to grow up in the late 1950s and early 1960s, but there wasn't very many of us. And as we and I read relatively widely, I discovered this fascinating collection of articles by this person called Christopher Freeman. And reading Chris's work, and in particular, his detailed historical accounts of what was going on in Germany and other places in Europe as the chemical products industry came into place, was a real inspiration. And I started sending letters to Chris, to which he responded. Those were the days before email or any of that sort. And that is how Chris and I got acquainted. And as Franco said, over the years, from sometime in the late 60s on, up until the current pandemic hit, virtually every year I used to spend a week or so at SPRU and loved it. And met many of you who are at this particular gathering there as faculty members or graduate students or visitors. And I remember in particular coming to know the young Giovanni Dosti, full of bounce and vigor and insight and brilliance. And it's very good to see you again here, Giovanni. During my years at Rand, I met Sid, who also had been a graduate student at Yale a couple of years after me. And that obviously had a very major impact in my own line of thinking and developing. But I think that's more than enough as a response to your first question about my path of development intellectually and the range of people who have influenced me.
Yes, and in fact, what you said brings the conversation naturally to your several key contributions, and I want to start to discuss with you the book, An Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change, that you wrote with Sid Winter, and which at that time proposed a theory and a framework that would be the reference for many of us, in which you had on one side learning and search in uncertain environments that lead firms to introduce novelty and lead firms to accumulate knowledge in specific and idiosyncratic way. You consider firms as organizations that develop patterns or repetitive action routines used in current activity. The context doesn't change, and then you discuss and propose three basic evolutionary processes that drive economic change: variety creation through innovation and entry or new venture, selection among firms, technology and products, and retention that creates continuity in several dimensions of the economic system. So I want to ask you why this framework and theory is so relevant for understanding the economy, and a related question: how much progress do you see in the last years in the development of evolutionary theory? This second part of the question will also be discussed between you and me at the end, when we will look at the challenges that evolutionary theory faces. But still, how much progress did you see? Dick?
Well, first of all, I'd like to observe, to highlight that the notion that the economy needs to be understood as an evolving system certainly isn't a new idea. This is certainly not something that Sid Winter and I sort of brought out and presented to you and said, here, look at that, that's new. I mean, think back, I think most of you have read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And the notion that what you have is an evolving system driven by technological innovation is very much there in Smith. You recall that the Wealth of Nations begins with his famous pin making example of how progress is occurring. And there, in the very first examples that he gives, he is relating technological change and improvement in the way various things are done to the way economic activity is organized, very much in the way that contemporary evolutionary scholars are doing. You read on through much of the classical economics tradition in Great Britain. It is very seldom is the term, the evolution used. The characterization in the text up through John Stuart Mill is very, very evolutionary in spirit, and very much of the orientation of those earlier economists is to an economy that is undergoing change, and much of what they're trying to do in their analysis is look down the road to see whether change, what kind of change will continue, and where the economy is essentially going to. It's only in the last part of the 19th century that the notion of the economic behavior is optimizing over a given set of ways of doing things, and the system as a whole is in equilibrium, begins to rise and become prominent in economics. And those of you who've read Alfred Marshall, and in particular the introduction to his principles, will recognize that while he is generally thought of and described as the father of neoclassical economics, he is very much interested in the process of economic change, and very much concerned that what was happening to economics in this day was it was becoming much more mechanical and static. So evolutionary economics is much more a renaissance of older ways of looking at what the economy is doing, how to understand what is going on at any time. Much more an emphasis of looking at what's going on at any time as a frame and a motion picture, rather than a particular position of equilibrium, which again you find in Smith, than something new. There are a couple of aspects of this point of view, which again I think you would find older generations of economists perfectly comfortable with, that I would like to highlight. First of all, the focus on of evolutionary economics is on how various kinds of things are done, on ways of doing things, and how these evolve over time. And the point of view regarding what you might call choice is that choice proceeds through a particular set of procedures, just as producing things or shopping things does as well. And my notion of the concept of routine is very much something that applies to individual behavior as well as to what goes on in organizations. From time to time, when I talk this over with Sid, he grumbles at that extension, but in fact, I think you can't understand individual behavior unless you understand that to a very considerable extent, all of us are learned routine driven. In terms of what is evolving and what the focus of the analysis of economic change is on, it gradually has become clear to me that there are two different kinds of evolution going on. One of them is the continuing improvement of broadly defined particular ways of doing things as a result of learning by doing, learning by experience, learning by using. And this is a moderately smooth process. What Schumpeter stressed, on the other hand, was progress through creative destruction, where radically new entities are coming on into the economy. And I would propose, as we have come to look and to understand much better at the changes that actually are occurring over a long period of time, what we have is aspects of both, where a variety of ways of doing things tend to be incrementally improved and achieve enormous advances over the years, but basically maintain a certain integrity to them. And on the other hand, a wide variety of new things keep on coming in. I think one of the significant advances in research that is relevant to evolutionary economics that has occurred over the recent years is the development of a large number of studies who have looked at productivity growth or progress more generally at the level of an industry or a sector containing a significant number of different economic units, firms. And that has enabled us to get and to be able to understand and divide up the kind of progress that's made within a sector between, on the one hand, a significant number of economic entities gradually improving over time what they are doing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the expansion of the entities that are doing particularly well and the decline and going out of business of the entities that are not doing so well. And I think what came as a surprise to many of us evolutionary economists was that the former, in most of the studies, tends to play a significantly more important role than does the latter. That in a sense, the general process of economic change, while it most definitely involves creative destruction, and the creative destruction involves the destruction of economic entities as well as ways of doing things, an awful lot of it involves what Benteke and his colleagues have been stressing from the beginning of their writing in this field, essentially learning. Economic entities learning to do better than they were doing before and improving their operation over time. And I think this is an important thing for those of us who have an evolutionary perspective on economic change, to get into our heads a little bit more solidly than I think we have to up until at least recently. There's been an enormous amount of emphasis, particularly in the modeling, but also in a lot of the empirical industry studies of creative destruction and the rise of new firms and the collapse of older one and the sort of the shifting of the distribution within industries. And there's been very little analysis within an evolutionary perspective of the process of the diffusion of new technologies and new ways of doing things across industries. A long time ago, as both I think Franco and Giovanni have been working with for very long, I have been arguing that it is incumbent on us to have a much better understanding than we do have at the present time regarding what is general public knowledge in an economic system regarding ways of doing things, technologies, managerial practices, the nature of the market, and so on, and what is kept private and proprietary. And for most part, we've done quite a bit of studying on how to keep things proprietary. We have done very little in the way of studying what makes things open and public and the institutions and mechanisms for doing that. There's been very little study that I know that we have done on things like industry or technical societies and what type of information is shared among various members of a technological community, and therefore is in a way is at least partially open to virtually all entities operating in a field of activity. In our looking at in our study of innovation systems, at the role of universities, for example, the emphasis has been on university research, and that has been extremely important indeed. But I think we have not looked in anywhere near enough detail at the role of universities, university engineering departments in business schools regarding management practice, in various fields of science, in terms of essentially serving as an area and an arena within which virtually all people going into a field get trained in the same kind of background knowledge, and furthermore change and get out into the industry or to the area as a whole, the new knowledge and its spread. I think we need to do an awful lot more on essentially the social and cultural nature of evolution in modern political social economies. And we've done less of that than I think we ought to have. We have stuck much more tightly to the notion of an economic system as something that stands by itself. Then, in fact, I think we should. What we have is a political and social economy. So I think that the broad idea that what we have here is economies as evolving systems, evolving political and social systems. I don't think you can understand economic change without understanding the political change that goes with it, enables it, and supports it in virtually all aspects of it. And in all those respects, evolutionary economics is very, very different than evolutionary biology.
Yes,
that's a long response to your first question.
Yes,
but I thought it was
yes. It's a very interesting and clear response, not just on evolutionary theory as it started, but also the progresses and the challenges, and basically also discussed your view of technology and innovation and the relationship between technological change and society, in a sense, moving from, let's say, Schumpeter, the Schumpeter of theory of economic development, of capital in socialism and democracy, and from Chandler on. So in a sense, I don't want to discuss more this issue because you have been already quite detailed and rich in discussing the progress and the challenges. But I want to focus on another key aspect of your writings. I quote a recent Industrial and Corporate Change article in which you claim, you make a strong statement. You say, more generally, in my view, one of the most important achievements of evolutionary economics has been the development of the concept of an innovation system. And in your view, and also in previous writing, institutions and innovation system play a central role because you focus a lot on knowledge, general public knowledge sources that are external to the firms, many non-firm actors that play a major role together with a variety of institutions in supporting and orienting firms. And I also link it to this discussion to the concept of national innovation systems that you, Chris Freeman and Bento Kelundal developed, and also the notion of sectoral systems of innovation. So the point to you is, compared to, let's say, the institutionalist school or other scholars talking about institutions, in which way your view of institutions is similar or differs? And I think it's an interesting issue to discuss.
Well, my first observation relating to what we're exploring here follows very closely on what I was saying earlier. I think it is a grave mistake to view modern economies that make very great use of markets in a wide variety of arenas of economic activity as, quote, market economies, unquote. In effect, therefore, relegating the use of non-market mechanisms, institutions, and structures to, in some sense, the periphery, and as exceptions to the general rule that what we have is a system that works through markets. One of the striking characteristics of the innovation systems literature as developed by Bentaka and Chris and me, though I think I probably stressed it even more than Bentaka. He may want to comment on this later, and Chris, was my growing emphasis on the non-market aspects of what is going on in innovation systems. The very important role of scientific and technological communities, the varied role of universities, which I think we have begun to look at over the last 20 or 30 years and have not looked at in anything like the range of detail that needs to be looked at. The role of government programs and policies. There's quite a bit of focus, for example, in the R&D and technical change literature on public funding of R&D. There's very little look at the role of government agencies in the coordination and orientation of R&D, which proceeds in parallel with and overlapping with market forces that are doing it as well. My strong proposition here is that we evolutionary economists and others have used the innovation systems literature term in a way that's useful in broadening out quite a bit in our way of looking at how technical change proceeds and who the key actors are, but we have not recognized anywhere near as fully as we ought to have that what we have here is a very complex system involving a wide variety of non-market mechanisms as well as market mechanisms. And I think economists and scholars of technical change need to get out of the habit of thinking that the principal mechanisms at work in virtually all parts of economic activity are market mechanisms. There are market mechanisms all over the place, but there are other very important other mechanisms at work too. There is this major issue of the term that I think that Chris originally put it in, he may have. I certainly used it, Bentaka certainly used it, of national innovation systems. And I remember as Nathan Rosenberg and I were writing the introduction to the book that I edited and put together. I forget the extent to which it is in Chris's book or in the book that Bentaka edited. That conception had two limitations that we should be aware of. First of all, it was much more aggregative in some sense than if you look closely, the systems were, in that it did not highlight the fact that you had very different institutional structures at work and mechanisms at work in different fields of activity. That agriculture was very different from medicine, was very different from semiconductors, and so on. And of course, since that time, and Franco has done an awful lot of this work, and so has Kuhn and others, we have got into the sectoral systems business of research to a much greater extent before. Though I must say, in so much of the general public discussion of science and technology policy, so much of what you read is being talked about proceeds as if there is a general technology policy, which for the most part there is not. For the most part, technology policies are a collection of sectoral policies with some high-level rhetoric on top of that. And they're very, very different and often operate out of different government departments and so on. The other matter, of course, was the national notion as if systems stopped at national borders, which they never did. And they're doing so less and less and less. I'm right now doing some interacting with people who are sort of writing on what technological systems and the patent regimes are going to be looking like over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. And the point I am stressing is that if you went back 50 years ago and you asked where technical change was coming from, where technical competences were, you would say, gee, it is Europe, it is the United States, and to some extent Canada, it is Japan, then Korea and Taiwan enter. If you look at what is going on now, a significant fraction of the major countries of the world now have significant university capabilities, have significant research capabilities, and innovation is coming from all over, and imitative capabilities without direct help from the original patent owners of technology. Imitative capabilities are now very, very widespread. And I think the whole set of issues regarding international spread of technology, the role of patents, and the enforcement of patents, and the resistance to enforcement of patents. We've seen some of this obviously bubbling up with respect to the vaccines and COVID and things of that sort. It's going to be very, very different now because such a much larger fraction of the world now has innovative capabilities than it used to be the case before. Of course, that's what Globelix is all about.
Yes, some of these issues and topics will be picked up by our friends and colleagues later on in the discussion. But let me just touch one last key contribution from your side, which refers to methodology. In a sense, in your 1982 book, and also later on, you propose a strong methodology in which formal theory has to be informed by and have to have a fruitful discussion with appreciative theory, empirical investigation, and case studies. Actually, appreciative theory, empirical investigation, and case studies lead the analysis, and the formal theory really comes later. And also in your most recent modeling efforts in history-friendly models, in which I took part, also you follow this strong methodological view of starting from empirical investigation, appreciative theorizing, and then leading to formal theory. So what are the main dangers of moving in the opposite direction, of being led just by formal theory, Dick?
I think the history of the social sciences in general, and economics in particular, particularly as you got into methodological discussions toward the middle of the 19th century, has been unfortunately over-focused on physics as a model of what a science should look like. And starting in the late 19th century, you certainly see it in Walras. But then it sort of runs through and increasingly becomes prominent in economics. The notion that in some sense or other, it is theory first, and the theory is formal and mathematical, and much of the empirical work is, quote, the testing of theory, unquote, becomes very, very prominent in economics. I don't know how many of you have looked at the paper I did, I guess about 8 or 9, 10 years ago in research policy entitled "The Sciences Are Different and the Differences Matter." But if you're interested in issues of this sort, I recommend it quite strongly. Actually, in writing that paper, I had some help from Stan Metcalf. I was then part-time work teaching at Manchester, and a number of his colleagues there helped me in digging into a wide variety of different sciences in terms of, once you sort of reading closely into the journals and the nature of what was published in the journals and what the science was all about, it becomes more and more clear that physics is virtually unique in a number of respects. Some of chemistry leans over in that area. Molecular biology does too, but molecular biology is basically chemistry. Only in those fields is it assumed that, and it works pretty well there, but not elsewhere, that the description of phenomena is largely quantitative. I think we economists and social scientists have slipped into that trap, in that much of our descriptive characterization is not well formulated quantitatively. That in some sense or other, in our characterizations, what we need to do is to use quantitative measures as means of sort of getting rough notions of size, direction, and things of that sort into a qualitative characterization of the phenomena itself. But essentially, our description is to a considerable extent in the form of verbal description and narrative, as contrasted with a set of numbers. And this is not very well understood at all. It's implicitly denied in econometric courses. This is one of the reasons why, at least 15 or 20 years ago, economic history began getting screened out of economics curricula. I think some of it is coming back. Furthermore, our theory, we do not have a mathematical theory. The notion that Walras is a theory is a funny notion of theory, if in fact what you have in mind as a theory is Newton, and that Newton's theory is designed essentially to explain detailed empirical phenomena. Walras and most of the models that we have, we were talking about formal models a moment ago, are allegories. They are useful in helping us to think about things, but we're in deep, deep trouble if in fact we think that they're accurate characterizations of what is really going on. Our own theoretical structures have to be much more qualitative than that. As you put it and I put it, they need to be much more appreciative theories. And this involves not simply a separation from the notion that we ought to be like physics, which I think is a problem, but that makes us much, much more like a lot of the other sciences. Those other sciences, by the way, from time to time, in their own methodological discussions, that deny what they are. Evolutionary biology, for example, has formal models.
Please,
But the form-
please mute yourself.
Devo dire la verità, sarebbe veramente un pecchetto che l'Inter...
Please mute yourself. Okay, please.
Right, the formal models in evolutionary biologies are allegories that help evolutionists sort of understand what is going on there. If you think about applied fields like medicine, as opposed with say to electrical engineering. Electrical engineering is to a considerable extent applied physics. It is heavily mathematical. Medicine is not. Medicine is to a very considerable extent descriptive and narrative, with some various numbers like temperature and blood pressure and things of that sort scattered into the general characteristics of diagnosis. And I think we have to learn to go back to our earlier, broader understanding of what the social sciences and economics are all about and what will work methodologically, and start pulling farther away from the notion if we only worked harder and were smart enough, we would be like physics. We're not. Our ontology is different.
Okay, thank you. We just move quickly to the last part of our conversation about the future challenges and the message to young researchers and PhD. You basically answered already answered the first question about challenges. You, in a sense, mapped out economic evolutionary theory today and progress and so on. If you want just to say one area of research not completely and fully explored by evolutionary theory, and related to that, I would like to keep it separate, but we don't have that much time because I want to then open the floor to questions. How do you foresee the future relationship with the dominant mainstream neoclassical economics that is so different from evolutionary theory?
I think that the research of the community that is participating in this discussion, parts of the community that I know, do fit my general point that we have been quite narrow in the sense of what we have looked at as in terms of an evolutionary system changing over time. Most of the group here has focused on various aspects of technological advance. If we extended this group to include many people who say are in business schools, there's been quite a bit of work on firm behavior within an evolutionary context. But there's been very little, though Giovanni's talked about doing quite a bit on it, and it may be that he's going to bring that in the book that he's currently putting together. We have done very little on the standard topics of what is now called price theory, like how are resources reallocated? How do you explain the distribution of resources you see in the economy at the given period of time, or what we're producing and what we're not producing? How do we explain prices and things of that sort? We, in a sense, shied. How do we explain income distribution? What really lies behind the fact that income distributions have deteriorated probably most in the United States over the last half century or so, but deteriorated quite badly in many countries of Europe and in many developing countries. In a sense, our focus has been so much on technology and technological change, which I think ought to be absolutely center in what's going on, that a whole bunch of these other topics we haven't looked at all. And I think the challenge for we evolutionary economists is to bring an evolutionary perspective, which is recognizing these aspects of economic activity as always changing, always being driven by change, with often technological change behind the scenes, and coming up with a serious theory, a serious understanding, better understanding than is in the textbooks right now of income distribution and whatnot. What is happening to the relationships of we evolutionary economists and more mainline economists? I have been encouraged by the fact that a very significant number of the most distinguished economists, including the Nobelists, that for all practical purposes, except when they're teaching theory, they've basically ignored neoclassical theory. You read, for example, Stiglitz and there's very little neoclassical in it. What's going on? Or the recent Nobels are given to empirical work, strictly empirical work, where the empirical work comes first. By the way, as it did for Newton. I mean, for you, it had many, many centuries of observations of the planets before Newton develops a theory to essentially explain planetary motion. The current Nobels went to basically empirical researchers. I was also being in Paul Krugman. You read the Krugman books or the Stiglitz books. They're breaking away from neoclassical theory in some sense or other. Post 1960s to 2000 neoclassical theory right now is something that's taught in economic theory classes, which I think students in economics are paying less and less attention to. And in a sense, our challenge is to get more and more influence on the methodology that is taught there, and much more influence on the empirical work concerned with how our economies are, why we're shaped the way we are, and how we're changing.
Okay, great. So if we want to conclude our first part of the conversation, which basic message or major advice would you like to give to young generations of PhD and young scholars interested in understanding the economy as a complex evolving system, Dick?
I think I've done most of that already, and I don't want to repeat myself. I think that what I would stress is before you get out there and model, study as best you can and look very carefully at the subject matter that you're modeling and theorizing about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dick, for this really very interesting, inspiring and stimulating first part of the conversation. Now I propose that we take a 5 minutes break and then we will reconvene, and I will ask some friends and colleagues to join us with their questions. Okay, so we have 5 minutes break. Thank you.
Okay.
So Dick, I see that you are back.
Yep.
And I think we should start our second part of the conversation. Let me tell you that Rajesh and I received so many questions from friends, colleagues, students, and so on. And I realized that we don't have enough time to answer for Dick to answer all the questions. So I apologize that for those that have asked questions or written to us and will not have answer from Dick. We will ask Dick to answer them in written form, and they will be published on the website. And what I will do now is I have ordered.
You're mute.
Franco, you're mute. Please unmute.
No.
So I said that the question that Dick will not be able to answer will be answered by Dick if he wants.
I'd be very happy to do that.
By mail, and we will publish on the website. And I said I will take the liberty to ask friends or colleagues step in a certain order, also because we received some questions already 1 week ago, a long time ago. And so, and then I will ask each of you to step in and ask questions to Dick. So the first one, and I'm glad to ask him, is Bentoke Lundvall. Bentoke, why don't you step in and ask a question to Dick?
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I would just like, before putting the question, saying that what you have in common with Chris is enormous wisdom. Not a lot of knowledge only, but wisdom and enormous generosity to share wisdom. And we had a wonderful experience of that today again. It's so wonderful to see you. You mentioned in passing something on institutions, including the role of business schools. And I've been thinking early on, when I see this parallel between routines and genes, the kind of genetic idea that you have kind of selection of good genes, etc. That one major difference is that we have a whole industry of people giving advice to what should be good practice, which should be good routines. We don't have that in biology. So I think in a way it could be quite interesting to consider these as crucial routines with impact on the theory itself. I mean, will this at some point raise issues about the satisficing that you have all these management consultants and all those business schools telling students what is good practice? And of course the question is raised, do they reproduce the existing routines, or do they actually upgrade them to make them part of what you refer to as the learning process?
No, I'm very glad you asked this question. Let me begin by remarking that even at the time we first put it down, I never was really comfortable with the routine as genes analogy. Even way back then, about a half a century ago, I suspected that if that was taken too seriously, that would limit the ability of further analysis to go forward in directions that it ought to have gone. I think it was used then, first of all, because we were looking for biological analogies. And as time has gone on, I have recognized more and more sharply how different social and cultural evolution is than biological evolution. And second, we were trying very hard to get away from the notion that human and individual and organizational actors in some sense are rather optimized. And that is what they did. Let me put the routine concept the way I've been thinking about it today, and in fact over many years. It first of all relates to the proposition that most of the things that individuals and organizations do, and I would extend the term to individuals as well as to organizations, involve a certain routine-like quality in contexts where what is going on is relatively familiar and you have lived in that context before and have learned to respond to it. It's a learned, relatively orderly way of responding to a particular need to do something or desire to do something. And you do these things without thinking about it much at all. This doesn't mean that when the routine was first developed, you weren't doing some thinking, but sooner or later, you've learned to essentially get it right. So routine essentially has been fine-tuned over a period of time. If the world stays relatively constant on you and it seems to work reasonably well, through learning by doing and using. And at the time Sid and I were writing the book, to flash back to that, we were very much influenced by the book that Richard Syard and Jim March were just putting out, called A Behavioral Theory of the Firm, where it's describing firm behavior in terms of various routines, to use our language, that they were following to set prices and give orders and whatnot. They were relatively automatically induced. And we extended the concept of a routine, not just to particular managerial practices, but also most technologies involve the use of particular routines. But this is a concept of a routine as a learned and reasonably effective way of doing something or achieving something in a particular instance. And the proposition, which I still will defend, and I think that you'll find most sociologists certainly going along with this line, or anthropologists, that most human and organizational behavior proceeds according to routines. But it just doesn't mean they're deans. They're generally learned behaviors for the most part. But I would certainly add on to that view of behavior that there are various circumstances under which the current routine won't work anymore, won't work satisfactorily anymore, because the world has changed on you, or you may observe somebody else that is doing something, and they seem to be doing an awful lot better than you are. And by observing, trying to understand what other things might be done, and copying, your routine will change. I argued earlier that often routines will change simply because you've learned something as you've gone along as to how to improve it. This aspect of it isn't working now, so I'll change it, and so on. I think both Sid and I would argue that routine change responds to a much greater extent through learning by looking around or experiencing something than it does through elaborate thinking, if you want to put it that way. But the looking around often involves looking around at what others and your competitors are doing. And I was arguing earlier about the very great importance of the fact that we operate in the social and cultural world, where we do know what others are doing. We have various mechanisms for learning about that. And then both individuals and organizations will experiment in terms of trying out various new things. And we will think, and we will calculate, and we will listen to consultants, if you want to put it that way. In a sense, we will read the articles in the business journal advising us to do various types of things, and we will ponder that, and we will listen to them. So you have routines that are changing all the time as a result of the world changing on us, our discovering and learning that in this slightly changed world, we really want to change this type of thing. We have to, because otherwise the darn thing won't work. They change because we observe what other people are doing. We change because of what our consultants are doing and what we're reading about. And it will change through formal R&D. And I forget whether it was you or somebody else who asked me the question. In our earlier formulation and in my formulation of this up until recently, have I overemphasized formal R&D as a mechanism of learning and changing? And my response to that is, yes, I think so. I think that I have underplayed, and many of us have underplayed, the very important role of learn back by feeding, by experience, by doing, by trying, by accidental things going on, and emphasize even too much, even though we're playing down fool and rationality, emphasizing too much the extent to which productive change occurs through fully rational processes.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bentocchi, and thank you, Dick. I'd like to ask Carlotta to ask a question, please. Carlotta? The microphone, the voice.
Yes.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Franco, and thank you, Dick, for your usual wisdom. My question is very ambitious. I'm just wondering whether what you just said before about how change doesn't always happen just in the economy or in technology, but it has all these other things, the policy and in other places, both in universities and elsewhere and so on. Do you think it's possible at all that evolutionary economics and an interdisciplinary approach could ever become the orthodoxy?
Let me first make a remark, not on your question, but they're going way back to my earlier statement I made. It is very clear that Chris and Keith and others working around Sprue had an evolutionary view of what is going on long before Sid and I wrote anything called an evolutionary theory of economic change. As I was saying, the basic idea here is a very, very old one and a very highly relevant one. We essentially renamed it and refocused on it. But one of the things that really encouraged me in going in this particular direction was that whenever I read people who are writing interesting stuff on how technical change occurred, it struck me as, gee, that really sounds right. I can interpret that view as an evolutionary view. But I think that's one of the reasons that Chris and I interacted so well together. We clearly had the same point of view regarding what was going on. Regarding will evolutionary economics take over? I'm not sure we'll take over cold that. I think a number of things that we should all be pushing for. On the one hand, a much more empirically oriented economics or economic analysis than is taught in most of the current graduate schools today, where to a considerable extent, it's, quote, the theory, unquote, that is pushed right from the start, as contrasted with, let's look at the economy and how it works. Of course, you can't look at anything that is as complicated as the economy without having something in the way of a prior point of view regarding what is important and what is not. But keep that relatively under control, and then essentially conceptualize about what is going on, a much more empirically oriented view of what economics is all about. And I think that is gradually happening. As I say, it's happening with respect to most of the large number of the Nobels, that have been giving out. It's happening regarding people like Kirkman and Stiglitz when they write for a non-professional audience. They're trying to describe what's going on in the economy and interpreting it. I think our point of view that we need to push very hard is that you're never looking at a static system. Some parts of it are moving slower than others, and some of them are just fine moving slowly, and others are really problems because they're moving so slowly. But basically, we're looking at an evolving system, and what you see right now has to be understood in terms of how you got there and where it is going and how rapidly it's going and what are the obstacles of change and so on. And third, I think that the barriers that divided up the social science disciplines, which really don't come into place until the last, third of the 19th century. It's very important that these be eliminated to some extent. That basically the notion that there's a field called economics that is very different than a field called political science, the field called psychology or sociology. We've got to knock that down. What I'm impressed by is you read the people who are now considered to be great economists of the last part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century. It's amazing how much of the other fields that they knew and followed. And I think people who are trained up in economics really need to be enormously encouraged to follow and read in fields that are adjacent to economics. I do not understand, for example, how you can understand macroeconomic policy, to go to Giovanni, unless you understand the politics and the ideologies associated with macroeconomic policies in different countries. But if you took a course in macroeconomics and a standard economics department, there's no discussion of that at all.
Okay, thank you, Carlotta, and thank you, Dick. This goes straight to Giovanni Dozzi, because the answer by Dick is very much close to Giovanni's questions. Giovanni.
Well, this is indeed close, and relates in many respects to that. I mean, one of the reasons why we lost, we must say, we lost, at least temporarily we lost, is because we had very little to say about macroeconomics, all macroeconomics phenomena, crisis, unemployment, income distribution. And in that, if I can, I want to be provocative. There is much more blame on you, Dick and Sid, and no blame at all on Chris, in the sense that you were talking too much to, you had too much in mind Bob Solo and Tobin, while Chris, and that was also the remark of Alan in the chat, was much more sympathetic to Keynes. I mean, he was well aware that Schumpeter in many respects was a fucking fascist, a sort of extreme right-wing Marx. And so he was sympathetic with Schumpeter on the idea of innovation and his possibly disruptive effect, but was definitely departing from him on all macro. Chris was involved in macro debate, the McCracken report. It was too hard possibly on the McCracken report, but was involved in that macro discussion. And as you, Dick, was remarking already before, we have been silent on price tier, income distribution, and this is a major priority. I think if I make a little comment on your optimism on where economics is going now, I think it's not going the way
Hopefulness,
we
not
want.
optimism.
Sorry?
Hopefulness, not optimism.
Okay, hopefulness. I mean, when you say they go in toward the empirics, but it's an empiric that you and I don't like and don't recognize in. I mean, the empiric is not getting whatever bloody time series from the lotto and then running it against some other lotto, somewhere else, and then saying, I invent imaginatively some instruments that correlate with the second, not with the first. And then I tell you that patents matter or don't matter in the successful entry of new firms in Uganda. Because this is basically the exercise that is done. I mean, I'm not talking about the so-called quasi-natural experiment and the things on which you get the Nobel Prize à la Duflo that are even more pathetic. But the empirics is essentially going in the direction of triviality. That is precisely the opposite to what you and Chris and Sid and Keith and myself also have in mind. So there are two questions there, big question. I leave the floor.
Dick?
First of all, on the macroeconomic issue, I think with the wisdom of hindsight, I certainly do wish that Sid and I had not totally brushed away issues relating to the Great Recession in that book that we wrote on the macroeconomic time series. But I think you got it exactly right. Our focus at that time was definitely on showing that we could do anything that Bob Solow could do, only significantly better. And we were not focused on the unemployment, recession, inflation cycle issue at all. Second, in fact, there has been some work within an evolutionary theoretic context on that. You've done some, Carlotta's done a lot. I think that some of the stuff you've done, Carlotta, on the cycle there and the relationship of finance and whatnot is really quite wonderful. And I'd love to see that picked up more. That, by the way, fits in relatively nicely into a bunch of pre and along the same time as Keynes discussion about long cycles and things of that sort, which isn't just Schumpeter, but a lot of people like Alvin Hansen are writing about the tendency of the economy to cycles, and whether cycle is the right term for it or not is an interesting set of questions. But yeah, that whole set of macroeconomic policies is something that we need to deal with. And I think between you and Carlotta and others, we've actually begun to do that. But we need to do an awful lot more of it. I think some of the empirical work that is going on right now, why am I blocking on our labor economist at Berkeley, who's one of the Nobels this year, who did the study of whether an increase in the minimum wage in one state, was it New Jersey, affected what happened to employment there when the state next door, was it Pennsylvania, did not. Who is that? Why am I blocking? Because I'm 91, that's why. And I forget those names. But there have been sort of detailed empirical studies that involve a heck of a lot more than essentially looking at time series. Actually involve getting out there and looking in detail about what's happening in particular episodes. Does that dominate economics now? No, it doesn't. but you have some people who are getting Nobels from that. And that guy, why can't I remember the name, is chairman of the economics department at Berkeley. I see some real hope there.
Okay, I think Francisco Lusa will come into the discussion because there's a question that quite related to what Dick, Giovanni, Carlotta, and Bentocchi were talking about. Francisco.
Well, thank you very much, Franco. Wonderful to see you, Dick, and you all. Well, I fully agree with what Bentocchi was just saying about wisdom, generosity, and curiosity should be added. I think it's a wonderful example you have been giving us, and it's wonderful to see you honoring Chris in this debate. Well, my question is about the challenge by evolutionary economics on the frontier between macro and microeconomics, because I believe that the strength of evolutionary economics would be to overcome that frontier and to include micro as part, well, meaning firms and sectors and so on, real behavior of real entities in the economy, real economics, as part of the overall economics, and in a certain way to rebuild microeconomics from the macro point of view, what Giovanni was saying about fairness and distribution of income and major challenges of economic policy and economic changes. But I believe that our balance sheet is not very clear on that matter. In a certain way, it is as if we have been trapped, not developing so much. The exceptions may be Greece, certainly, Carlotta, Giovanni, in a way. But we certainly have, well, a lot of other works as well, Bentocchi, Stan, a lot of other people, but we have not been developing as much a macro view of macroeconomics. But my point is, and the question I'd like to have you some comments on, is on the opportunity of the micro collapse of neoclassical economics, because there's a disarray in a sense. Well, all the Lagrangian utility functions, all the theory in microeconomics disappeared. And the only remaining parts of real work which is being there, it's what you have been mentioning, cards and other people working on empirical data, on minimum wage and different other fields. So in a way, it is as if in neoclassical economics, after the building being collapsed, some people are trying to rebuild a more data mining sorts of approach. Of course, there's a danger in that. One of the founders of econometrics would criticize the econometric work many years later on, saying that people were using their energy to measure the keyholes in northern Iceland in the 14th century and looking for data about it. It is irrelevant or trivial. But again, looking at firms' real behavior in economics could be an approachable view. So in that sense, evolutionary economics could be part or should be part or is part of that understanding of concrete dynamics. So my question, Dick, is could you elaborate a little more on how do you see the possibilities of developing new breaks in that sense and new dialogues with different people? What could be attained in a short-term period? Thank you.
Well, I think for a long, long time, there has been a significant gap between most of the subfields of economics that are concerned directly with empirical and empirically related policy matters, and the way theory is taught. I interacted for many years with both his friend and then his colleague with Joe Peck, who is basically the organizer of the industrial organization structure of graduate education at Yale. And industrial organization in the US is very much like industrial economics in Europe. And which is amazing how little of standard theory, except concepts like oligopoly or monopolistic competition and things of that sort were brought in. Mainly the field was empirically oriented, and so was labor economics. And for the most part, what I've gradually come to realize is that much of the world, though not all of it, alas, was able to survive the dominance of neoclassical economics because you had so many economists who, while trained in that field, did not pay any attention to it when they went out and were concerned with policy. I was, as I said, on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors in 1960, which was a period of time when neoclassical economics was absolutely dominant in the theoretical teaching at the major graduate schools. But hardly any of that stuff entered the way people like Jim Tobin or Walter Heller essentially gave advice to the president, or the way that the 1960s annual report was made. So maybe neoclassical economics has done less harm outside of economics. If you look at countries like Chile, it certainly played a major role as it came from Chicago on down there. I think the whole concept of a macroeconomics or macroeconomic variables has to be reconsidered in economics. What strikes me as the more you look at it is how heterogeneous the particular entities that we study and give names to are. You mentioned firms. Well, firms include General Motors and Siemens. 2 blocks from where my apartment is, there's a local grocery store. In California, I live in a senior citizens place that has 180 residents, and it's very different than the grocery store. Yesterday, I got a couple of taxi rides. The things does it make sense for us to think as if we can have a single, quote, theory of the firm when there are so many different kinds of things called firms? Or do we have to learn to disaggregate within the categories that we have to some extent? Or think of thinking about common elements differently. I am much concerned that the focus on GNP, real GNP or GNP per capita or per worker as a measure of economic growth has taken attention away from the nature of economic growth or economic development in the countries that have been experiencing it. That measure captures very little of what's going on. You can't understand economic change or economic development that's going on unless you understand the new industries coming in, the old industries that are fading out. Regarding income distribution, or you can consider the overall unemployment rate. Most of us are academics. Those of us who are not academics are professionals of one form or another. When the unemployment rate goes up or down in our country's statistics, it affects us very little. We continue to have our position. does the overall unemployment rate make all that amount of sense as something to look at? Or does it make only sense because underneath the aggregate, a number of things that are really important tend to go up and down with it? In which case, should we pay a lot more attention to what goes up and what goes down and what doesn't go up and what doesn't go down with the overall unemployment rate? What do you mean by the money supply? I don't know what anybody means by money anymore. Back in the times I was taught as a graduate student, we had numbers like M1 and M2, and I'm sure that a number of you who are almost as old as I am remember that. M1 included currency in circulation and checking deposits. M2 included savings deposits. Nobody had credit cards at that time. What on earth do you mean by the money supply now? What does the Federal Reserve or the Central Bank of England or whatever it is mean when it says it tries to keep the money supply under control? What is the money supply? An aggregate of different kinds of things. I think there are real challenges that not because we're evolutionary economists, but because we sort of look at the empirics and recognize diversity and differences in things going on. That there's a real challenge for us for sort of rethinking how we characterize the economic reality that we're trying to understand, including what makes people poor or well-to-do or employed or unemployed and whatnot. And I think you cannot understand that very well by aggregating everything up to a single number that describes the economy as a whole.
Okay, thank you, Dick, and thank you, Francisco, for the question. We have a related question by Professor Sivakumar. Please, Professor Sivakumar.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Professor Nelson, it's been delightful to listen to you. Never heard you before. I'd like just to add a little addendum to what you have said about macroeconomics. One of the big reasons why we have not been able to catch up with macroeconomics at all is because we are not able to provide a methodology to study the enormous, widely varied and diverse financial and monetary institutions that exist in the world today. If one looked at it at a micro level, if one looked at it at a ground level, the effects of these evolutionary forces in the financial and monetary world are stunning. I'll give you an example. There are virtually hundreds of thousands of women in rural India who belong to organizations called self-help groups, which are little non-banking financial institutions organized in a micro spread across the country, thousands of them, and they operate quite vast quantities of money which are invested on behalf of these women and which are regulated fairly decently by the government. In short, what I'm trying to suggest is we need to look at ways in which the financial and monetary institutions have themselves evolved over the last 50 years before we are able to say anything about macroeconomics. Thank you, sir.
Let me respond in two different ways to that. One is to get in a point that I wish I had gotten in more explicitly to a question asked earlier regarding the narrowness of the research that we economists who take an evolutionary perspective have undertaken. We have done very little work on changes in institutions or changes in ways of doing things or of structures that embody and control those ways of doing things beyond fields that we have come to call technologies. We have done very little work, for example, to pick up on your point, on the way finance and financial institutions have changed over the years. We've done very little work, despite the fact that we have examples of lots of scholars, starting with Alfred Chandler, in looking at changes in the nature of large business firms. We do very little of that. We know that both of those developments are very much connected with and interacted with the development of the modern economies that we face, that we have, the development of technologies, forms of business organization, forms of finance, forms of regulation, forms of government programs, all evolved together. And we have looked at that hardly at all on that. And I think we've got to broaden in that way, and that I think that is also the route to beginning to come to an understanding and being able to write about why is the allocation of resources that you see in the economy today the way it is. Why do we produce the kinds of things that we produce rather than other types of things? Why are prices and remunerations to factors of production the way they are? What determines that? It's not simply the market. It's all of these things coming together in a complex way, which leads me to a major issue. I think that economists have tended to aggregate concepts much too much. On the other hand, it is clear that anything even trivially as complex as the economy cannot be understood by, quote, looking at it. You can only look at selective pieces of it, and what you look at depends on the intellectual structure for looking at it. I think we've got to develop a new understanding of the role of theorizing, which focuses on certain types of processes and not others, that aggregates in certain types of ways. We have a theory of, quote, the firm. That is a mode of aggregation. We define something called firms. Do we want to include not-for-profit firms as well as firms in it? Do we want to include independent proprietors that essentially sell things in it? Or do we want to, how do we want to disaggregate? I don't recall ever having had a discussion of matters like that, either in the way I was taught economics or in the way I teach economics. And I'm not doing it anymore, but a lot of you folks are. Do you want to bring up these things in your classes? And how do we look at anything as immensely complicated and always on the move as something like modern economies? There's a wonderful article by Herbert Simon entitled The Sciences of the Artificial. Yes. I remember reading many, many years ago that influenced me greatly, in which he is saying that one of the real challenges of the social sciences is that our ontology won't stay constant on us. The ontology of physics tends to, so universes expand and things of that sort, that atoms remain basically atoms. But on the other hand, to go back to what we were talking about before, the things that you might want to characterize as money are very different now than they were 25 years ago, enormously different than they were before. What you mean by a firm is entirely different than it was before. Therefore, the theory of the firm that makes sense for Marshall, if you have a general theory of the firm, open a question about that, doesn't make sense in the 1960s and doesn't make sense today. If you look, for example, at all those firms involved in the internet, they're not selling to customers who essentially use their service. They're essentially making their income by essentially getting funds from advertisers and giving their wares to us for free. Does that enter the way we teach about the theory of the firm in our graduate school, graduate training? Do that enter much in the way of the economic textbooks? The whole nature of economic activity is changing us, and I think we're ignoring it.
The discussion is so interesting, and we are almost out of time, but I propose that we continue, I would like to hear the question of three panelists and then we will close.
Professor Malerba.
Yeah.
Here's Mu from China.
Yes, but I would like to ask first Ned Lawrence, and then I'll ask Eric Reinert, and then Mu Romping. The three of you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Later on.
Let's start from Ned Lawrence's question, and then move to Eric.
Okay.
Thanks very much. And Richard, it was great to listen to you and to hear this defense of empirical work and the need for even descriptive work, storytelling, looking at what's going on and not just simply running, as Johnny was saying, it's become so narrow, just running regressions and then being obsessed with problems of identification, finding that instrument, that some of it is not very useful. My question actually is complementary to Bandok's, and it has to go back to the routines, the building blocks of organizations, and some of it I think you answered, but it was the word hasn't come in yet, the question of tacitness, which I think in the book was quite important. You did with Sid, and it was in part linked to the contextualization of the learning process of built-up routines, maybe to some limitations to imitability between firms, because tacitness is sort of something that can't be just observed. It has to be, perhaps observed and copied. Has it changed your view of the importance of, and of course, tacitness comes in other areas like industrial districts, work on clusters, work on local systems, anything to do with proximity. But has your view of the importance of tacit knowledge any way changed over the years, and how important it might be, and has the current so-called fourth industrial revolution and all the discussion of automation in any way changed your view about how crucial this dimension is?
I think we need to understand better than we do the strengths and the limitations of various social communication systems. To go back to something I was proposing earlier, I think that there is very limited recognition of how limited numbers are and mathematical conceptions and apparatus is in describing the reality out there. It's a very limited language that we have. And that's why, in some sense or other, I think economics, much of the social science, much of biology, deals with phenomena that transcend the ability of those languages to provide an adequate characterization on their own. I think the same is so for every oral and written language that we have. And a lot of the issue of tacitness comes about from the limitations of the language we have and its ability to characterize different types of things. I was thinking, for example, when I got the written version of your question, of how you can get a book that describes in very great detail how to hit a good forehand in tennis. And there's absolutely no question that that will help you to groove your forehand. But different people are going to learn to do that in ways that are remarkably different, one from another. Some of those differences clearly relate to different physiological equipment that people come on with. But also an awful lot of it comes from what they have learned by doing and playing and whatnot. There's an enormous amount of experiential learning, to go back to that I think that Sid and I think many of we evolutionary economists and students of technical change have missed. That in a sense you learn by doing and by feeling, and a lot of what you learn is not going to be that fully articulable. I think about a football team. In some sense or other, you can describe what they're doing, but they have learned a whole bunch of very intimate, very specific kinds of things in terms of working together. I think one of the great advantages that some of us miss during this during a Zoom session like this is they're just sitting around the table together and being close to each other and looking at each other's eyes as we talk. We in a sense, the communication is different and better, and things get across. Yeah, I think artificial intelligence is just remarkable, the kind of thing that it does. But I think that there always is going to be a very considerable amount of tested knowledge. And as I said, I've become more and more impressed by how important it is in terms of the learning process. It isn't that we've learned, we can't describe so much what we've learned. We've learned it, and we know how to do it, and we just do it.
Okay, thank you. Eric Reinert, please. Eric.
Yes, I had also noted down the words generosity and wisdom, which Judith and Chris had in common. So I think this is something we have all appreciated. I wanted to address Chris' very important idea of tracing the idea of national innovation systems back to Friedrich List, the German economist who was born in 1789 and died in 1846. He had an implicit dichotomy, increasing and diminishing returns. He wanted to protect industry, but he did not want to protect agriculture. Another important point with Mr. List is that Karl Marx started being interested in economics after reading Friedrich List's 1841 work.
I did not know that.
Yeah, there's a very interesting book by a Ukrainian scholar, Sporluk, Communism, Nationalism, Karl Marx and Friedrich List. He's a Harvard professor. It's really very useful. So Marx got his ideas from List, and you sometimes I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School. I'm not a Marxist.
Please send us the reference, Eric. Please send us the reference of.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that also. But there's at one point Marx says that he is in favor of free trade in one set of circumstances. When there are agricultural, non-industrialized countries, he is very much in favor of free trade because that will keep them poor and that will help the revolution, right? So here is it is List reflected in a very strange way in Marx, and I think if we introduce that in evolutionary economics, there are certain things we can explain. I have a student who I sent to the question who wrote the book. She wrote a book about technological retrogression, a Schumpeterian interpretation of modernization in reverse. So she studied Indian fishermen. They were very efficient sailing on the high seas. Then they innovated by outboard engines. They got so efficient that they emptied the sea and could no longer afford petrol. And during this generation, they had unlearned how to sail, so they went back to rowing boats. So if you innovate against what John Stuart Mill called the flexible wall of diminishing returns, you may end up in these things. And I think this also explains why non-industrialized countries tend to stay poor, and it probably also explains why the most efficient agriculture producers in the world, in the United States and in the EU, need protection. Why? And subsidies. You know, why do the most efficient farmers in the world need protection and subsidies? If we understand that, we also understand the importance of diminishing and perfect competition. So I think just adding one point, barriers to entry, I think from a business school point of view, barriers to entry is the key variable for income distribution. This is what keeps the high wage, high profit, high wage industries, distinguishes them from the low profit, low wage.
Nick?
Well, first of all, to repeat a remark I made earlier, I think it was a mistake to come to define the way economies like the United States or much of Europe operate as simply market economies and not recognizing the very great importance of the political governmental structure behind them. The political governmental structure can do a variety of different things, from positive things like providing support for agricultural R&D and extension and things of that sort, to essentially blocking any attempts to support an industry or a group of people, just essentially letting it go out of business. But whatever it is, what happens to an industry is what happens politically and ideologically. It's not simply market, where the market is part of that particular context. I think it is extremely interesting. I think that we evolutionary economists who recognize that not only ways of producing things, but what is produced changes over time, really need to rethink what you mean by demand or demand curves or what is bought. In a sense, the standard demand curve concept is sort of something that slopes down from left to right as a function of price and things of that sort, with very little recognition that at least over time, the nature of what is sold or what is offered changes to a considerable extent. In some sense, there is a major difference between those industries or sectors where the demand in the broad sense of the term is elastic, so that technical change within the industry increases output and employment within the industry, and industries where that is not the case, where in some sense or other demand is inelastic, like much of agriculture. But in some sense or other, a lot of that very much depends on what is happening to the product itself. And what is quite remarkable is where I think we see elastic demands over time, we've also seen enormous changes in the nature and the quality of the products. And in agriculture, in various areas, you have had what looks like elastic demands, but in a sense, what's happened there is that the nature of the products have changed considerably over time in transportation and whatnot. To go back to a remark I made earlier on innovation systems, I think the notion of a national innovation system held us off for too long from sectoral innovation system to understand how different agriculture is from medicine, is from electronics.
Turn off the mic.
One thing that we didn't do effectively and still haven't is essentially to have an analysis of the system that goes beyond what's happening on the innovation front, to look what's happening to the industry itself and employment in the industry and so on. And I think that is the way one of the roots that is very important for the expansion of an evolutionary approach. To look at the dynamics of change within a sector, growth and decline, and so on.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you, Eric. Rong Ping Mu, please.
Thank you, Professor Malerba, and thank you, Richard. So I still remember 5 years ago, we met in Montreal, the International Schumpeter Society Conference. So actually, I have lots of questions. However, I find time very limited. So I think maybe, I just want to ask you or the others, the concept innovation and development. These two words puzzle me a lot, because during the past 30 years, I focus on innovation policies. Nowadays, we have a lot of the practices in China, especially in the regional cities and some regions. So nowadays, in the policy perspectives, it's innovation policy or innovation development policies. So I want, can you give me some explanation between the two concepts, the relationship between the two, the innovation and the development? Thank you.
I think we use innovation as a term in a much more micro context than we use the term development. In that the term innovation is used most naturally as referring to a change in the way of doing something, or a change in the change in the nature of something that is produced or done. And it's quite specific to innovation in aircraft, or innovation in automobiles, or innovation in citrus fruits, or innovation in management. Whereas the development term, I think, is more generally used in terms of what is happening to an entity that involves a wide variety of different activities, different ways of doing things going on at the same time, both producing automobiles and rice, and having a number of different people who are associated with different organizations. From that perspective of what the difference is, it is very reasonable to say that that innovation in different arenas of economic activity is a key driver of development more broadly in the region or the entity that you're looking at. And the terms are used in a complementary fashion, but they're used in different types of ways in terms of the level of aggregation of the phenomena to which they're referring.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have now a very, very short question by Mamo Mucci. Very short because we are way over time. Mamo. Voice, the microphone mic, Mamo.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Now I'm open. I sincerely appreciate Dick Nelson's very. I thought he's now 20 years old. He's not old yet. His mind is still very young. I've just learned a lot from him today. So I just want to say that. And I really appreciate all of you. And the discussion was amazing and the participation was very good. I just want to say to you, Dick, that I'm using your evolution economics on how to create a unifying model of innovation system for Africa. And I just want to say to you did very interesting things like simulate and understand intereconomic and non-economic actor interactions and dynamics, co-evolution of economic and non-economic governing institutions, practices, and understanding, interaction of policies, knowledge, incentives, institutions, practices, and system building to identify significant interactions and interfacing of different elements and components, bridging the gap between theory and reality, and the source of organization for stimulating innovation, imagination, creativity, learning, competence building. And what didn't you do? To understand how routines are formed and novelties emerge and prepare. What I want is, I want the agriculture, industry, and services, and the different sectors, the technology also, the digital and non-digital, all these things now to be interacted. And I want to develop a very powerful new thinking based on your all the contributions, Chris, you, Bentoke, all of you who are here now have been contributing from your ideas. And for Africa, you know, Africa is always rejected. So Africa needs to be revived. And I really like all of you to think about it. And I just want to appreciate you for all the great thinking you have provided to me. And I learned a lot from you. And I want you to live longer and really produce more and interact with all of us more and more. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate it. Thank you, all of you. And also my brother, Franco. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Okay, I think time is indeed way over, but I'm really amazed by all the enthusiasm and the interest that there has been around this conversation by so many friends and colleagues in discussing with Dick on so many important and relevant questions. Keep in mind that all the other questions will be answered that have been coming in by chat, will be answered by Dick by mail, and will be put on the website. Let me just conclude by thanking you, Dick, for this really wonderful conversation, which was rich, which was broad, and which was deep. And I think it has been indeed a unique meeting gathering with an intellectual and scholarly giant. And I think it's really fair to say that all our research stand on your big and strong shoulders. Thank you, Dick. Thank you also all the friends and colleagues that have asked questions and participated to the discussion. And I said that thank you also all the mails that have arrived. They will be answered by Dick in the next days. I also like to thank Rajesh and his team. They did a wonderful job in organizing this conversation. And so time is over, and I want to give Rajesh the last word. But thank you.
I want to put
thank
in
you,
one
Malerba.
And I want to come up with one word before the last word, which was, as we all raise our figurative glass, to Chris.
To Chris.
To Chris. To Chris.
He was a house.
Rajesh, please come in.
That's nice.
Thank you very much. This has been a very humbling experience, and we are all overwhelmed by the overwhelming response from the panel, from the two of you, and all the participants. Thank you, Professor Richard Nelson. Thank you, Professor Franco Malerba, and thank you all the panelists, and also all the participants for spending more than 2 hours we have spent together. And thank you so much. Our next program in this series is scheduled on 8th of February 2022. The program will feature Professor Mariana Mazzucato, and she will be talked to by Professor Giovanni Dossi. So this is going to be a very exciting program on 8th of February. Until then, goodbye and thank you all. Thank you very much. I have a request. Let us all unmute and say bye-bye before leaving. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you, Dick.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Jersey.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you all.
Away from virus.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Elson, Franco,
Bye,
Matt.
Shulin. Shulin, take care.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Yeah.
Bye, Kuna.
And I saw Stan. Hello, Stan. And
Yes.
many nice people I haven't seen for so long.
Quite a while.
Wow. Okay.
I'm
Bye-bye.
so happy. See you all.
Great.
Nice to see you.
I like to see you.
Bye-bye.
Hi.
Bye-bye.
Hi.
Bye-bye.
Saluda.
So great to see you, Shulin. Hello.
Yeah,
hello.
great
Yes,
to
indeed.
see you, my Mamuchi,
Yes.
my brother, my
Yes.
brother.
You are my meme.
Brother.
Yes. That's wonderful to see all of you.
Yeah, see all of you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yes. So Rajesh, you okay? Well, we chat later. Yeah.
Thank you.
But my sister Shulingo, I hope to see you. I hope we see each other.
We come to China.
No, I want to come to China.
Have a line
No,
down,
yes.
line lower.
No,
Now,
last time when there was a program, you were in the program. I was
I
hoping to
said
see you.
line meetings.
Long time. But so lovely to see you. Really wonderful.
Lovely
Professor
to see you. Where is your tools?
So happy.
I want to ask Professor Shulingu, will you be available for such a program? Will you join us for a program like this featuring
you? Just write to me. Write to Jinjun. Please write to Jinjun and Jinjun with me in communication. Okay?
Okay. Definitely. I will write. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you
Yeah,
for your
so lovely to see you.
organizing.
Yes.
That's great.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay. Right.
The solution is combine the West and the Eastern wisdom. The approach to that we should pay our efforts.
Yes. But China is now, Ethiopia at the moment, China, India, Russia are supporting us, but the West is not supporting us. The West is attacking Ethiopia.
I know.
So
therefore, China is in face of a lot of difficulties. And also China, the Chinese government must do well